Thank you very much, Jim, and we have a small gift here from the conference in gratitude for an excellent presentation.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Cheers. Those lights are incredibly bright. All right, so it gives me great pleasure now to welcome our second keynote speaker for the morning, once I persuade Siri to not take over my tablet for me. Sue Roberts. As I said before, Sue is a colleague of mine formerly from Victoria University of Wellington, where she was our librarian, but she's also now the Director of Library and Learning Services at the University of Auckland, and someone with a long career in leading strategic change in an important component of what it is that makes a university a real place. She has a 15-year career that spanned working in the UK, in Australia, again in another Victoria, the state in this case, through Victoria, Wellington and New Zealand, and now here in Auckland. And we look forward to hearing from Sue and her thoughts on where our futures are going to be taking us over the next decade. So I'll invite Sue to join us up on the stage.
Very cold hands. Tēnā koutou katoa, everyone. Good morning. I've got really cold hands because it's cold sitting down there. So poor Stephen just had the fright of his life from my cold hands. It's really great to be here with you this morning and to talk about uncertain futures. So I have been and continue to be fascinated by how we think about our future, by how we vision, how we plan, how we strategize, both at a micro level, because we do it in our lives every day, every week, every month, and also how we do it with our teams, how we do it as organizations, how we do it as professions. And for those of us who take on leadership, and that's all of us here, it is the most critical work that we do on a day-to-day basis. So we've already heard a huge amount about trends. Jim has just kind of blown my mind with the stuff he's talked about. John yesterday frightened us into a panic with anxiety. I couldn't sleep last night by thinking of all of that in terms of what's coming. So how do we think about vision? How do we think about strategy in a period of uncertainty, in a period of anxiety, without the panic overtaking us? Now, Stephen talked a little bit then about my background and my career, but he didn't tell you the most important things. So the most important things that I just need to share with you to give you context is that I am the eldest of 3 children. So I would just like everyone in the audience who is the eldest of any to put their hands up, please. I feel your pain. I see you. I also am the first in my family to go to university. So I'd like those in the audience to put their hands up who were first in family to go to university. And for those of you who are the eldest of children and the first in family to go to university, we're going to have a counselling session at morning tea. So we'll meet in the lobby. But I worked very hard, as my brothers and sisters did. I need to say that, otherwise I'd be in big shit, to get out, to do well, to pass exams and so on. I'm also from a nowhere place. I can't even show you on the map, in Lancashire, in the northwest of England. It used to be famous for mills, so there was a big milling community, and then they all closed. And then it became famous for mines, and then Thatcher closed the mines. And then it became famous for rugby, but only rugby league, so no unionists, please. And they won the league once in 1971, and everything went downhill from there afterwards. It is now famous for having the most pubs per head of population in Britain. I'll just say that again. The most pubs per head of population. So that's where you want to go when you go on your holidays. So as a result of this, I grew up to be the bossy kid. So the bossy kid, the control freak. Those of you who are the eldest in your family, first in university, you know what I'm talking about. Bossy kid, the control freak. So the idea of uncertainty, ambiguity, really, things you can't pin down, things you can't control, things you can't shape, pummel into submission, that scares me, and has scared me the whole of my life. So what I want to do with you in the next 25 minutes is share with you how I face this fear and how I learn to live with that ambiguity and that anxiety. So I've changed my theme slightly. One of those very annoying speakers that change their theme, just not at the last minute, but a little bit, which is really to also talk about developing vision and strategy, but also implementation, because actually the implementation is when it gets really hard. And I'm going to share some ideas with you and some kind of concepts and models. They're not all, in fact, none of them are mine. I've stolen them from many other better thinkers. But these are things that have resonated with me and that have helped me as I've thought about and worked with many, many amazing people on this. So I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk about why we should bother at all with vision and strategy in times of uncertainty and change and anxiety. I'm going to talk about the real secret to developing vision and strategy, the real secret that we try and kind of, we forget about. And then what do we do when implementation gets hard? So I'm going to talk about that for quite a bit towards the end. So there are many people who think, let's not worry about vision and strategy, let's just see how it unfurls, and then let's write our strategy in retrospect when we get to the end of that and say that's what we intended to do after all. And there is somebody in the audience who does that, so do not laugh, the person who's thinking about that. But what I want to do is just talk about how strategy is still so critical in an uncertain world. So come on. No. Do you have to do it really hard? It's not doing it. Stephen may have to do it for me. It's the other one. You're right. I think I've got... There we are. Hooray! Hooray! So we had Einstein yesterday. I've had several theories of the evolution of different animals, and I thought we'd have a little bit of Darwin. So Darwin basically talked about how it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, so that's universities out there for us, but it's actually the one most responsive to change. And really, I see vision and strategy as enabling us, as critical for us in order to change and evolve, and to change and evolve personally, professionally, and as organisations. So developing vision and strategy and creating change are completely intertwined. And I hope you do know that Charles Darwin did come to New Zealand. He came on the Beagle, and he actually came to the Bay of Islands. And for those of you who've been to the Bay of Islands, it's the most amazing, the most beautiful place. He got off the boat, and he came onto shore, and he collected a few specimens and looked around and thought, oh, I don't like it here. Got back on the boat and headed off. So he was obviously having a really bad day, I think, when he came to New Zealand. So vision and strategy can seem quite abstract, can seem vague, can seem very macro level. And I want to really just to kind of offer you something that I think about all the time when I think about creating vision and strategy for my own life, for my own team, for my organisation, and to think of it really as a story. To really think, and we've talked about digital storytelling quite a bit already at this conference, and I want to just take it back to storytelling, end of story. Which is really our purpose for existing. So a vision and a strategy is about our purpose for existing. It's about our why. It's about our aspiration. And it is interesting when we think about, there's been a massive resurgence in the last few years in terms of storytelling, and we've seen that in all kinds of forums. And it's because the human brain is hardwired to want to grasp, to understand stories. It's hardwired into us. And so it's not surprised that there's been this huge resurgence. And so I think if we think about vision and strategy in terms of story, it is a lot easier to engage with it and to really convince and be compelling. And I thought I'd talk about a hipster version of TED Talks. So I'm sure many of you, particularly the more hipster people in the audience, and I'm not one of those, by the way, I've engaged with and enjoyed The Moth. Can I see your hands, please? Oh, we're not as hipster as I thought. Oh, my God. Right, okay, we've got to sort that out. So The Moth is a series. It's a bit like TED Talks, but for hipsters. So it's more informal, it's more human, and there's an amazing podcast which is really all about stories. And it's called The Moth because they wanted to start this new tradition of oral, really going back to an old tradition of oral storytelling. So really orally telling stories on the porch, and people would gather around the porch, and obviously the moths would be drawn to the flame of the storytellers. So that's why it's called that. But Neil Gaiman, and we need no excuse to have a wonderful quote from Neil Gaiman, to have some of his poetry at a theatre conference. He's a huge fan of this movement to bring more stories into our lives. And he talks about why the moth has been such a huge phenomenon, mainly in the States, but also more globally. And he says, and this is what I think captures the power of story: the moth connects us as humans because we all have stories, or perhaps because we are, as humans, already an assemblage of stories. And the gulf that exists between us as people is that when we look at each other, we might see faces, we might see skin, colour, gender, race or attitudes, but we can't see the stories. And once we hear each other's stories, we realise that the things we see as dividing us are all too often illusions, falsehoods, that the walls between us are in no truth no thicker than scenery. And I think as organisations, as teams, as technologists, as librarians, if we think about vision and strategy as story, really as what story are we telling about ourselves, how do we tell our story, then I think it will be far more powerful. So I promised in my abstract, and somebody's already asked me, Sue, are you really going to talk about VUCA? Or you might say VUCA. I say VUCA, you say VUCA, it's the same thing. And I said I would touch upon this a little bit. So we certainly have, we know, we've heard this over the conference already, that we live in a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So the VUCA concept came out of the American military, but that's okay. It's still useful. We can still use it. And it really applied to describe extreme conditions in Afghanistan and Iraq that they were facing. Now, I'm not saying for one minute that working in higher education in New Zealand is like being in Afghanistan or Iraq. By any stretch of the imagination, but certainly these concepts have been helpful for people thinking about why are our staff so anxious? Why are we kind of struggling with this ambiguity? But I also wanted to share with you. So it's one thing to kind of say, to acknowledge, yes, this is what the world is like now. This is what we're living in. But what are our strategies when we try and lead people through this? When we really try and be purposeful about what we're doing? And I wanted just to kind of share with you an experience that I had last year. So some of you in the audience are involved, as I am, with the Aurora Emerging Leaders Institute, and we actually have some Aurorans here in the audience as well, so welcome to you. And it's an institute that runs across Australia and New Zealand for emerging leaders in the library and information profession, for higher education and other sectors. And last year we had a new curriculum, and we decided to focus quite a bit on this whole area of uncertainty, ambiguity, complexity. And the participants, for them, this was the biggest issue. This was the biggest issue by far. How do they really deal with, as leaders, as emerging leaders, as managers of people, this context? And the facilitators took them through some amazing exercises. And the big lessons from that were, what do we do when there isn't a clear path or consensus? And every day at work we're dealing with this. There isn't a clear path, there isn't consensus in where we're trying to go. What do we do about that? And the big thing from looking at the exercises they did and hearing these amazing people talk about what it felt like for them was we need to engage people even more to avoid polarisation. And we've seen polarisation happen in institutions. We've seen it happen in countries. It's happening right now all around the world. So we don't squash dissent. We bring it out. We create clearings for that. We are present to it. We provide spaces for people to come to engage in, to come to solutions and options. And in order to do that, we have to develop our skills of giving permission, of facilitation and coaching, which is far different than skills around control and an organisation and planning. So how do we really develop our skills around that? I also wanted to share with you briefly some other tools for thinking about this VUCA. I have real trouble with U's. When you're from the north of England, all U's are very big, so VUCA, world. So I wanted just to share with you an article that I found really interesting, which is Strategy for Turbulent Times, How to Prosper When All Advantage is Fleeting. So the concept for this is really that we can't build on what we've done before, because actually we can't rely on it. The sands are shifting, and that we need to really think, we need to move in a different way. There's a fantastic article by Rita Gunther McGrath that's a few years old now, but I would recommend it to you, where she really talks about how to shift from extending existing advantage, and you can see some of the things that she talks about there, to being capable of coping with transient advantage. And I would say, certainly in my experience where I've worked, we've focused on building on and extending existing advantage, not actually coping with transient advantage. So what she says is we must learn to launch new strategic initiatives again and again to create a portfolio of advantages. We need to set broad themes and let people experiment. We need to build strong networks and relationships. That we need to, and this is an interesting one for all of us who have been through, have instigated, or are thinking about restructuring, the R word. So she says we need to get systematic to actually avoid restructuring and learn healthy disengagement rather than having to kind of completely reinvent ourselves every few years. And that we should experiment, iterate, learn, get systematic about early stage innovation. So I would just recommend that to you to have a look at. So if I've kind of talked about thinking about vision and strategy as a story, and what I want to do next is kind of share with you what I think the real secret is to getting an amazing story, to really thinking about something that connects with everybody that we work with, everybody that is involved in our work, our stakeholders. And that's no surprise that that is engagement. That is engaging ourselves and others in that whole process, in that whole thinking about where we're heading and why. And I think that's even more important in a world where we've got ambiguity and uncertainty. If we don't set direction, if we don't engage people in creating that direction, then we cannot lead them to achieve that in that, and strategy will fail. But the first thing I want to say on this and to stress is that we can't engage other people unless we are enrolled ourselves. And I don't know about you, but I've certainly worked in organisations, and I've probably done this myself, where it's kind of like, we'll do that. Okay, we'll do that. And how can we enrol other people if we are ambivalent about what we are trying to do ourselves? So people will invest in making something a success if they were part of its development and genesis in the first place. But what we tend to do is think these are all really good ideas, we'll just get on with all of them, and we'll try and control and channel and push people down certain paths. So I really think our job as leaders, our job here, is to develop that engagement at every level of our organisations, and to really think about how we do that. When we do that, what happens is we get pushback, and we get people who really get concerned and anxious and worried about where things are going. And one of the things that our job is as leaders is to really think about for ourselves, how do we get out of our comfort zone to where the magic happens, and how do we enable other people to get out of their comfort zone to where the magic happens. And that's not always easy. That's not always easy because we're not always comfortable ourselves in dealing with discomfort. And often in our organisations, we protect people. So we protect people really from the truth. We don't trust them and bring them into the folds to really talk about the issues that are affecting us. And for those of you who know the work of Heifetz and Laurie, who talk about adaptive leadership, they talk about how followers want comfort, they want stability, they want solutions, but that's babysitting. And our work is not to babysit people. So real leaders will ask hard questions, they will knock people out of their comfort zones, and they will manage the resulting distress. We will just manage the resulting distress, and we will be with that distress, even if it is tricky. And change and strategy and vision are about learning and growth, and these are uncomfortable. We should be, during this conference, uncomfortable about some of the things that we are exposed to, that we think about, because learning and growth are uncomfortable, and that we need to normalise discomfort. We work in institutions that are all about learning and growth, so we should be able to we should be able to be comfortable with discomfort, if you know what I mean. And I just want you to have a think for a minute, and I think about this quite a lot. In our teams, in our universities, in our organisations? Do we really expose the reality of situations to our people, to each other, or do we protect people from it? And the more we can expose that reality, I think the better. So I've kind of talked about vision and strategy, the criticality of storytelling. I've talked about the importance of engagement. So we've spent our time and effort engaging with staff, engaging with multiple stakeholders, engaging with students. We've scanned our environment and the horizon. We've taken back all our ideas from conferences like this one. And we've developed a really relevant and compelling story about where we're heading and why. So that job done. Job done. That's it. Oh no, job's not done. So however hard it is to devise smart strategy, it is 10 times harder to get people to execute on that strategy. 10 times harder. And we have a far more naive and immature understanding about how we translate strategy into results. We have a far less developed idea of that. And certainly research has found that 2/3 to 3/4 of large organisations fail at implementation. They fail. And so I wanted to analyse that problem with you a little bit more, just to analyse that. There's a really great article by Peter Bergman, and he's a fantastic author to read up on if you're interested in this whole area. And he talks about we don't have a strategy problem, we have a people problem. So he really talks about, in other words, our biggest strategic challenge isn't strategic thinking, it isn't strategic planning, it is strategic doing, it is strategic action. And he talks about how we need to think about this and how we can change how we think about this. So I know we've had some amazing visuals at this conference. We've had some fantastic videos, we've had some fantastic images, and I know there are some actually great artists in the audience amongst us. So I sat up all night and I really thought about how I could convey how Bergman talks about alignment, how he talked about alignment in terms of execution of strategy. And I came up with this. So we talk about alignment in terms of this is where we need to be going. This is where our biggest strategic challenge is in terms of that direction. But what we really have in our organisations is something like this. So we are all focused in our own work. Our teams are working in their own different areas, in their different silos. And what do we usually do when we know that this is an issue for us? What do we usually do? When we think we're not aligned, we've got teams doing lots of different work, what do we think about? And what we usually do is we usually do more communication. So we'll communicate more, we'll get more messages out there, we'll do more briefings, we'll have another newsletter, you know how it goes. And communication isn't, and the reason it doesn't work is we are really focused on trying to communicate and transmit the message. We're not focused on understanding. So we're not focused on, actually, do we really understand? Because we've rarely stopped to check whether it has been understood. We've been so focused on getting the message out there. So the myth is that communication equals understanding. And really, the aha moment I had in a few months ago was thinking we don't really want a communication strategy. We actually want an understanding strategy. And how do we really get to the bottom of that? One of the great things about working at the University of Auckland is the investment that's been made in change and in thinking about change and in thinking about change management. And the university has adopted ProSci as our change management methodology, and it's just a method. There's lots of other methodologies out there, and sometimes it's a really useful tool and sometimes it's not so useful. Can I just ask who uses ProSci in their work now? There'll be mainly University of Auckland people, some University of Auckland people there. So it's just a tool, it's a change management tool, and others of you may use other change management tools. But one of the great things about ProSci is the ADKAR model that is really valuable for thinking through this issue around, well, if we keep communicating, if we just keep communicating, they'll get it. They'll get it. And the ADKAR model, basically, you also have a change checklist. So you start with an awareness for change. You then move to a desire to change, knowledge, ability to implement, and then reinforcement, really, of that change. And what this is really saying is we often, in organisations, our natural tendency is to go straight to knowledge. So we think we're working on a new strategy around technology, we're working on implementing change. We go straight to let's train people. Let's train them and really focus on what do they need to know, what knowledge do they need, what training do they need. And what this model really helps with is thinking, if we don't start with awareness, if we don't start with I understand why, there's no point. There is no point if we don't start with I understand why. And people can actually know why and have no desire. Have no desire at all, and we've all worked in contexts like that. And it's only when we work through those and we get to ability that we can actually execute. But our natural tendency is to jump straight to knowledge and ability instead of really thinking through awareness and thinking through desire and working a lot more on those spaces. And I think the reason we don't do that is because they're really hard. They're really hard. Raising awareness and enabling people to move to desire is hard. But we need to spend a lot more time in there. I want just to kind of finish off in the last kind of 5 minutes in really talking about some solutions to these challenges around how do we really move forward with strategy implementation in that context of ambiguity and uncertainty. And a lot of authors and a lot of people talk about alignment, that whole thing around we've got to all be aligned, we've got to all be focused in the same direction. And certainly I've heard people talk about we've got to define, the big arrow, the big things that we're focused on and get everybody hyper-aligned and laser-focused on where we need to go. But actually, certainly the longer that I work in organisations and work in different countries, and it's the same wherever you work, the more that I think it's not really about that alignment. That is important and it's necessary. And the research does support as well that actually it's behaviour that will lead to the outcomes that we want. It's behaviour. Yet we tend to focus a lot on planning and alignment and kind of moving everything down a certain path. But actually it's behaviour. So that alignment and planning aren't really the problem. They're not actually the main thing we should be spending our time on. The big issue is trust. So often we see across organisations that and it comes out of staff surveys. I don't know if you've ever seen this. So you often we do these staff surveys and people say, I think I do my job really well. I think my team is brilliant, my immediate team. Everybody else, forget it. Everybody else, forget it. And every team says the same thing. So it can't always be true, can it? So it's this whole thing around we as a team, we trust each other, we have a high degree of trust, but we don't feel we can rely on others. And when that happens, what do we do? What do we do when that happens? It leads to a host of dysfunctional behaviours. So it leads to a whole host of duplication of effort. We let promises slide. We delay deliverables. There's resentment, there's frustration, and that piles on and on top of each other. And obviously this leads to conflict and damage when we lose that trust. And another pitfall can be top-down control, because we obviously people talk about how we need strong leadership, and that comes from the top, and that will be the great success point. But actually, execution in strategic terms and thinking about implementation should not be driven from the top. It reduces our capacity to execute over the long run. We deny our staff the opportunities to develop their skills, to take initiative, to make decisions, to own results. And then we complain that when they can't do it. So we need to strategically invest in the behaviour capabilities and attitudes of our staff across the whole service. And if there's one thing we could do is to invest far more in those behaviours, to invest far more in that. What I want to do is to finish off with two things, really. So to finish off with saying that execution does not mean sticking to a plan. It doesn't always mean sticking to a plan. It can mean changing what we do. And unfortunately, no Gantt chart survives contact with reality. So I know we love actually I hate Gantt charts. I should love them because I love control and I love, I love knowing what's happening, but I actually hate them. And they never survive contact with reality. They change within 2 seconds. So we should embrace the fact that we respond, that we are iterative, that we are changing. The other thing is also that we need to collect and share more data, and we need to hold a mirror up to ourselves by sharing and collecting that data, and by actually saying, this is who we are, what does this mean, what does this really tell us, and to face the brutal truth around that, and to not shy away from some of those. And we've certainly done a lot of that at the University of Auckland and in my team, and I'll just show you briefly one example of how we've done that, which is really to try and say, this is about collections and services and libraries and information and libraries and learning services, to say this is us, this is who we are, what does this tell us? And there's some really good things in this, and there's some really scary things in this. So to finish off, I began talking about a VUCA world and about uncertainty and ambiguity. And one of the things that I think as leaders we struggle with most is, how do we deal with people who say, when will we know? When will we know? And what will this mean for me? And as one person said to me once, not here, when will it be over? And I said, it'll never be over, actually. And how can we embrace what we cannot control? And I think the main thing is that we can strategically develop. We can develop our plan. We can develop ourselves, but we can develop our muscle. We can develop our muscle to be able to deal with and respond to ambiguity and anxiety. And we can be with people when they are anxious and they are concerned. The good news is strategy execution in times of uncertainty is not one moment in time. It is 1,000 moments across time. So the good news is that we can keep practicing. We can fail. We can practice. We can succeed. And we can get ourselves and the people that we work with to where that magic happens. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you.
Little gift from...
Thank you, Stephen. Chocolate, marvellous.
Chocolate's always welcome, I have to say. So, just in case you hadn't caught up from yesterday,